We hear a lot about Australia's whopping $40 billion of education exports and how the sector is the biggest product we export that we don't source from the ground. But economists are now becoming sceptical about how we've arrived at figures like $40 billion. Just how is this off-quoted figure calculated? Joining me now to discuss is economist and writer Dr. Cameron Murray. Cameron, you recently wrote a piece on your website, Fresh Economic Thinking, about these claims. Are you suggesting that we need to take the $40 billion figure with a grain of salt?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Rita. It's a bit of a puzzle to be exporting something from campuses in the centre of our capital cities. So I decided to really dig in and see what's going into that number, that often quoted $40 billion. And it turns out that at the heart of this number is what I've called a statistical trick, whereby international students, unlike any other tourist or resident, are assumed to be foreigners, and it is assumed that all their spending is therefore counted as an export. Whereas if they were a working holiday maker or another temporary resident who was able to work, that assumption wouldn't apply, and hence their spending wouldn't count as an export. But there's a carve out there just for international students. And so what that does is essentially transform, by assumption, all the assumed spending of these students from normal domestic economic activity into what can be called an export. And therefore the university sector gets this halo effect of being this great exporter when it's really just a statistical artifact.
Well, yes, it seems like these figures are being purposely overstated. Is it just so universities could trumpet what they're doing, or what other purpose would there be behind this little statistical trick?
Look, I think it's fine to do this and measure how much spending is generated or how much activity revolves around the stock of international students in the country. But I think when we take that number and then misinterpret what it's doing, we then end up with this political debate where universities are now participating, saying, open the borders to us and we will export this activity, when we know, for example, more than half of the international students are working. Most will roll over into longer term residency visas. And as soon as they do, that stops counting, right? The same activity. So there's a lot of misunderstanding and misperception, and has really seeped into the political debate around international students and how they fit in the broader immigration program and the broader higher education programs.
Well, I tell you, this is fairly disturbing news as a Victorian, because for us, this is our biggest export, we're told. But you're explaining, really, to even call it an export is questionable.
Yeah. So, for example, if I was a temporary resident with a different type of visa, and then I rolled onto a student visa and nothing else changed, all of a sudden, all of my spending would be counted as an export. So it's really a weird thing. And I think what we need to do is be realistic that these are not exports. This is economic activity that is generated, and it's an estimate, and it's not a great one at that. But we shouldn't let our political debate be directed by this export story.
Absolutely, and this $40 billion figure that people just say, and they've just accepted it uncritically. Dr. Cameron Murray, thank you so much for explaining that for us.
Thanks for having me.